beggars, thieves, malcontents, exiles, basically the cast-offs of civilized society. As Byzantium transformed into Constantinople, this new Rome followed a similar pattern. The emperor put out the word that he was looking for men and women and families to come fill up his new capital. But the respectable citizens of the empire were respectable because they had a good thing going right where they were. So the citizens who initially heeded Constantine's call were the struggling, the failed, and the disliked from across the empire who were desperate for a fresh start. This group was augmented by the greedy, the ambitious, and the ruthless, who saw in Constantine's city an opportunity to get in on the ground floor of something really big and make a killing in the process. I think it's safe to say that you would not want to invite Constantinople's first generation of citizens to dinner. As we saw last time, after initiating the process of transforming Byzantium into Constantinople, a process that would take just 6 years, Constantine turned his attention most especially to establishing unity within the Christian Church. When the Council of Nicaea wrapped up its business, though, he invited the bishops up to Nicomedia to help him inaugurate his 20th year on the throne, backdating his rule to the death of his father, of course. Antoninus Pius had been the last emperor to serve for more than 20 years, and at just 53 years old and with his health never an issue, Constantine looked poised to set a new standard for longevity. Though in the end he will only be sole ruler for about 12 years, when Constantine died in 337, his 31-year tenure in the purple will rank him second only to the divine Augustus on the all-time list. And speaking of Augustus, after celebrating his anniversary, Constantine made his way over to Aquileia in the spring of 326, and it was here that he decided to follow in the footsteps of that first and greatest of Roman emperors. Unfortunately, the footsteps he decided to follow were the ones that contemporaries and historians alike agree were the biggest missteps of Augustus's career. Faded and overly cruel Lex Julia that sought to legislate sexual morality and failed miserably? Yeah, we're back to that. Second up, you remember how Augustus lashed out at wayward members of his family by exiling them? Well, Constantine is about to outdo the emperor in cold-hearted brutality, because where Augustus merely exiled members of his family, Constantine is about to kill them dead. Constantine's morality laws followed the Augustan precedent in that they established an idealized model of family life and then rigidly demanded adherence to the model, with draconian punishments doled out to the wayward. The only difference really was that Constantine's laws came down particularly hard on women, especially on the issue of premarital virginity, and were rationalized with appeals to Christian scripture rather than appeals to traditional Roman virtue. As with the Augustan attempt to scare everyone straight, though, Constantine's morality laws wound up inflicting punishments on a few unfortunate souls far in excess of their crimes, pouring molten lead down the throat of a servant who aids a couple in eloping? Really? While ultimately having very little impact on how people actually live their lives. It was while he was in Italy in 326 that Constantine then took his second cue from Augustus, and, deciding to do the old boy one better, wound up committing one of the more heinous crimes you can possibly commit. He ordered his eldest son Crispus seized and executed. No one knows exactly why Constantine suddenly turned on his son. That is, what specifically Crispus was supposed to have done, but there is near universal agreement that the emperor's wife Fausta was behind it all. Some people claim Fausta attempted to seduce Crispus and was rejected. Others claim Crispus raped his stepmother in a fit of passion, though this accusation can almost certainly be dismissed, while others simply roll with the old familiar tale of a stepmother looking to get rid of a stepson so that her own children can ascend to the throne. Whatever the reason, she allegedly framed or set up Crispus. The frame-up or set-up job was effective, and the emperor, convinced of something, ordered his boy executed. There is a centuries-old rumor that Crispus fell victim to Constantine's new morality laws, but a far more likely guess is that Crispus was implicated in a plot to overthrow his father. We have no way of knowing if the charges were true, and certainly nothing in Crispus's life or career even hint that he planned to turn on his father. But as that great military philosopher Saul Tigh once said, no one is a traitor until they are. So, who knows? The consensus, though, is that Crispus was framed, and most likely framed by Fausta. Certainly what happens next does not bode well for her historical reputation. After Crispus was executed, the imperial court moved down to Rome, where it was joined by Constantine's mother Helena, who had been living in the city since her son's victory at the Milvian Bridge. Shortly after the emperor's arrival, Helena appears to have met privately with Constantine to discuss the circumstances of her grandson's death. We don't know exactly what proof she presented to Constantine, but it apparently convinced him that his lovely wife had just tricked him into murdering his own son, because straight away he had Fausta seized and put under guard. Then, torn by an understandable mix of grief and rage, he decided that an eye for an eye was the best way to go. The most commonly told version of the story is that he had his wife put in a steam room, the doors were locked, and the heat was cranked up to 11. The Empress suffocated in the unbearable heat. Just like that, the Emperor's son and wife were both dead, and both were dead at the Emperor's hand. Even in the far more permissive ancient world, these were serious crimes that would haunt Constantine for the rest of his life. The Emperor remained in Rome for a time, and then began a slow journey back to Nicomedia. Well aware that he had maybe screwed up pretty royally, and that his reputation was going to suffer, especially in the Christian circles who tended to look sideways at things like murdering members of your own family, Constantine sought to minimize the damage, and maybe change the subject by sending his mother Helena on a religious pilgrimage to the Far East. She was sent to identify key locations in the life of Jesus, initiate construction of any shrine she felt appropriate, and wherever she went, to liberally spread the imperial wealth. In other words, she was on a goodwill mission to help head off any tarnishing of Constantine's image. The mission succeeded beyond the emperor's wildest expectations, and his mother's tour of the East, which, among other things, officially determined the site of both Jesus' birth and his death, built a number of important churches that stand to this day, and then came home with pieces of the true cross, inspired thousands and then millions to follow in her footsteps and make a pilgrimage to what was now starting to be known as the Holy Land. Like her son, she is not known as Saint Helena for nothing. With the heat from this double murder partially deflected, Constantine was able to get back to the business of being emperor without suffering too much for his crime. The questions I want to spend the rest of this episode on then are, aside from his promotion of Christianity, what kind of emperor was Constantine, and what role did he play in the evolution of the empire? In general, the answer is that he was, in almost every way, the ideological heir of the old senior Augustus Diocletian. There were differences, of course, the biggest being that Constantine had no truck with the division of imperial labor, but other than that, we see him continuing Diocletian's policies, and refining Diocletian's policies, and extending Diocletian's policies, but only rarely do we see him turning away from Diocletian's policies. Despite the failure of the Tetrarchy, in the end, most of what Diocletian put in place wound up defining the next few centuries of the empire's evolution. Even Constantine, radical, visionary Constantine, appears to have seen no reason to fundamentally change much of anything at all. First off, Constantine completely bought into the ideology of the emperor as the divinely appointed ruler he had built up to elevate the emperor above mortal men, though obviously Constantine looked to God rather than Jupiter as his ultimate patron. Constantine dressed exquisitely, wore a diadem, remained sequestered from all but the most important dignitaries, sat while others stood, and was addressed as Lord Constantine, or Sacred Constantine, or Divine Constantine. Diocletian had redefined the role of the emperor in the empire, and Constantine played the new part to perfection. But it was not just in the optics department that Constantine followed Diocletian's lead. In the realm of imperial administration, he followed the old Senior Augustus as well. He made only minor tweaks to the reformed provincial divisions Diocletian had established. Military and civilian careers were kept separate, and real power was increasingly shifted to the emperor's ever-expanding central bureaucracy. Constantine added new positions and new layers to the already elaborate governmental apparatus he inherited, and did everything he could to enhance the dignity and cement the authority of the imperial bureaucrats. His only break with Diocletian in this regard is that Constantine was not so eager to thumb his nose at the senatorial class, especially since he was in the middle of an all-out assault on their religious beliefs. Following through on the promise he had made following the Milvian Bridge to renew their old privileges, Constantine reopened most of the higher offices in the empire to men of senatorial rank, and eagerly welcomed them into his administration. He coupled this reform with a deliberate move to reduce the number of equites serving in government. Now, this appears to be a pretty significant shift in policy, but there was actually less to it than meets the eye. Because though Constantine opened up all these positions to men of senatorial rank, he also significantly lowered the bar for admission into that class. In effect, all those equites who were now barred from this office or that post didn't really care, because, hey, look at me, I'm a senator now too. When Constantine enrolled a new senate to serve him in Constantinople, it did not number 300 or even 600, but 2,000. The senatorial class was welcomed back into power, sure, but only after Constantine had carefully watered it down. Constantine also continued with Diocletian's almost scientific approach to taxation, though when coupled with his monetary policy, Constantine really did a number on Diocletian's vision of everyone sharing in the burden of empire according to their particular means. Though for the most part Diocletian's tax structure continued to function as it previously had, Constantine began pushing to augment the in-kind system with new taxes that were to be paid in precious metal, just like the good old days. The political and economic systems of the empire had stabilized considerably since Diocletian had initiated his tax reforms, and Constantine felt like it was time for his subjects to start paying in cash again. This move was coupled with the emperor's introduction of a carefully crafted gold coin called the solidus, 72 of which were to equal 1 Roman pound. Though no one knew it at the time, the soundness of the solidus would become legendary, as its weight and purity would be maintained for the next 700 years at least, forming the basis of the Byzantine economy and almost single-handedly helping to keep the West from falling into a strictly barter economy following the fall of the empire. But unfortunately, Constantine focused only on the gold standard, and he basically left silver and copper coins to fend for themselves, which helped to exacerbate the growing divide between the rich and everyone else. Those rich enough to deal in gold found that their wealth and power was now shielded from the ravages of runaway inflation, while those further down the ladder, in particular the middle-class merchants, once again saw their lives and livelihoods threatened by an unstable economy. The most pernicious aspect of Constantine's new gold and silver tax, which was directed primarily at the commerce of the merchant class, was that it was only assessed once every 4 years. That is, the collectors would come around and demand a lump sum of what you owed to cover the next 4 annual budgets. You can imagine how much stress this would cause us today,